Trump's 28-point peace plan has stunned governments across Europe. On paper, it looks like a path toward ending the conflict. But when you read the details, it becomes clear why Kyiv is alarmed and Brussels is terrified. The plan starts with a full ban on Ukraine ever joining NATO. That alone reshapes the entire security map of Eastern Europe. Then comes the American security guarantee, but not as a free commitment. Washington would guarantee Ukraine only if it receives financial compensation. And based on how US deals usually work, that could mean billions or even hundreds of billions flowing into American accounts over time. It immediately sets a commercial tone, and many analysts have described these clauses as godfatherish. Another part of the plan triggers a sanctions snapback. If Russia enters Ukrainian territory again, every sanction lifted under the agreement returns instantly. Any recognition of new borders is revoked, and Moscow loses every benefit it gained. This mechanism gives Washington leverage while technically offering a path for Russia to return to global markets. Trump even proposes bringing Moscow back into the G8, signaling a full reintegration into Western political and financial structures. For the United States, this is manageable. Yes, more than $100 billion in support for Ukraine is gone forever. The weapons, the cash, the aid, none of it is coming back. But Washington sees this as the cost of closing the file. Its liabilities end the moment the deal takes effect. Europe sees something entirely different. After 3 years of crisis, the continent is left with damaged industry, weakened energy security, and economies some describe as a smoldering ruin. The continent has lived through mass de-industrialization, soaring costs, and collapsing competitiveness. And now, under Trump's proposal, Europe must contribute another $100 billion into the reconstruction fund. That is on top of everything it has already spent, and Brussels simply does not have the money unless it seizes even more Russian reserves. European leaders understand what this means. They carry the bill while Washington walks away with leverage, contracts, and influence. This combination, security limits for Ukraine, financial compensation for the US, and massive new obligations for the EU, has pushed Brussels into panic mode. The plan looks less like peace and more like a financial settlement designed around American interests. And to push the process forward, Washington has delivered a blunt ultimatum to Kyiv. All US military and intelligence support could be cut off if Ukraine doesn't move toward a deal by this Thursday, and the signs suggest the deadline is real. And this is where the next layer of tension begins, because the way frozen Russian reserves are used will determine who truly benefits from this settlement and who ends up paying for it. The fate of Russia's frozen reserves is the core of Trump's plan, and this is where the real power struggle begins. Moscow still has roughly $300 billion trapped in Western systems, and the new proposal breaks that money into several buckets that all serve Western interests. The first $100 billion is the most straightforward. It will be placed into a reconstruction fund for Ukraine, but the entire effort will be led by the United States. American manpower, American firms, and American contractors will take the lead. Washington would receive 50% of all profits generated from this reconstruction program. The remaining 50% is unclear. Trump's plan doesn't specify whether that slice goes to Ukraine, the EU, or even Russia on paper. The lack of clarity has already created tension between European capitals. The second $100 billion is even more controversial. Europe will have to contribute this amount directly to keep the fund running. And for Brussels, this is a painful demand. After years of crisis, Europe does not have spare capital lying around, especially if the money does not come from Russian reserves. Leaders across the continent know that raising $100 billion during a period of de-industrialization, weak growth, and soaring public debt will be extremely difficult. Some officials have said it might be nearly impossible. What remains of the frozen funds is the most sensitive part of the entire plan. These remaining billions will be pushed into a joint US-Russia investment vehicle. On paper, it sounds like shared cooperation. In practice, it means Russia will not get its reserves back in the form of cash or liquid assets. Instead, the money will be turned into long-term projects, especially in territories currently under Russian control. These projects include developing mines, extracting critical resources, and building rare earth supply chains at a time when the United States is desperate to secure new inputs for its technology and defense industries. This structure makes one thing clear: Russia's reserves will not be returned. They will be absorbed into Western-managed ventures that align with Washington's goals. And because these investments focus on resources buried under Ukrainian soil, the financial story quickly connects to the deeper battle over minerals and strategic control. Beneath the politics and the diplomacy lies a much deeper motive: the minerals under Ukrainian soil. Kyiv has claimed for years that the country holds almost $15 trillion worth of mineral wealth. Most experts agree this figure is wildly optimistic, maybe even several times higher than what is realistically extractable. But the exact number matters less than the fact that the ground does contain real strategic materials. In the territories now controlled by Russia, there are deposits of rare earths, critical metals, and industrial minerals that modern economies depend on. For Washington, this is not a side issue. The United States is locked in an ongoing trade and technology war with China, and access to new sources of minerals has become a national priority. If American companies gain a role in rebuilding or investing in these regions, they also gain leverage over the supply chains growing out of them. In some scenarios, Russia might even work with the US because American involvement would lock long-term Western interests into the region and reduce the risk of another major conflict. But extracting minerals is only the first step. Processing them is where the real power sits, and this is where China dominates. More than 90% of global rare earth refining capacity is under Chinese control. That means even if the US and Russia manage to pull valuable resources out of the ground, they still depend on China to turn those materials into something usable. This imbalance is why the mineral layer of the conflict feeds straight into the larger global financial shift now underway, especially as countries begin rethinking how safe their reserves truly are. Russia's frozen reserves didn't just shake Moscow. They sent a warning to every government holding money inside the Western financial system. Before the war, central banks were quietly buying around 15 tons of unreported gold each year. It was a slow, steady trend, but once the West froze Russia's assets, something changed. Unreported gold buying suddenly surged to more than 200 tons a year, a 14 times jump. That kind of spike does not happen by accident. It reflects fear that reserves held in the US or EU are no longer fully safe. This fear is strongest in the global South, where countries depend heavily on the dollar system but have fewer political guarantees. The logic is simple. If Washington can seize Russia's assets, it can do it to another government if the political climate shifts. And that uncertainty pushes countries to rethink how much of their wealth they want tied to US Treasuries. The numbers make the trend even clearer. Since the start of 2025, India has reduced its treasury holdings by $23 billion. Mainland China has cut $60 billion, and when Hong Kong is included, the total reaches almost $80 billion. Even Brazil, a major BRICS member, is aggressively dumping its US debt. These moves aren't isolated. They are part of a larger recalibration of risk. Every sale sends the same message. Long-term trust in the dollar is weakening, and as major economies shift away from US bonds, the financial pressure naturally accelerates the search for alternatives. A shift China is already preparing to exploit through its banking system and global lending strategy. China has been preparing for this moment for years, and the freezing of Russia's reserves only accelerated its plans. Beijing understands that controlling supply chains is important, but controlling money flows is even more powerful. That is why China is now pushing a financial strategy aimed directly at the core of US dominance. The first step has been to reduce exposure to the dollar. The central government has been selling US assets, and Chinese commercial banks are quietly shifting their portfolios toward RMB-denominated holdings. This change is visible in the explosion of overseas RMB lending, which has become one of China's strongest tools for reshaping global finance. The anchor of the dollar's power is the Eurodollar market, the huge network where banks outside the United States borrow and lend in dollars. This system is massive. Loans and bonds alone add up to about $13 trillion, and when you include other dollar-linked instruments, the total climbs to around $76 trillion. Many analysts argue this market is even more influential than the petrodollar structure that tied oil to the US currency. As long as the world keeps borrowing in dollars, Washington keeps control.
If you are using a stable coin in Nigeria that's backed by the US dollar, you don't actually have to have dollars. It's on your phone. You can transact. So I think there's a very good chance that crypto is actually one of the things that locks in dollar supremacy.
And that clarity explains why China is racing to undermine the Eurodollar system. Beijing has pushed its banks to reduce the volume of dollar loans they issue abroad while rapidly expanding RMB lending. Since 2020, external RMB assets held by Chinese banks have quadrupled, reaching almost $0.5 trillion. Over that same period, their dollar holdings have fallen. The financial incentives are straightforward. Borrowing in dollars costs more than 4%, while RMB loans sit below 1.5%. For many companies, especially those already importing from China, shifting to RMB debt became the cheaper and safer option. And after 2022, as global rates surged, RMB loans quickly moved from a niche product to a mainstream alternative. China wants the RMB to function exactly the way the Eurodollar does today. By expanding its lending network, increasing RMB liquidity, and reducing dollar exposure, Beijing is constructing the foundation for a parallel financial system. And this strategy naturally leads into its next move, using gold to secure its reserves and reduce vulnerability to Western sanctions. China's financial strategy goes far beyond lending and bank balance sheets. The final layer is gold, the one asset that cannot be frozen, seized, or digitally disabled by any foreign government. And over the past few years, Beijing has made it clear that gold is becoming its main shield against Western sanctions. Reports from the Financial Times and Goldman Sachs both indicate that China has been consistently underreporting how much gold it buys. In September alone, China purchased around 15 tons, but officially reported only 1.5 tons. That's a 10 times discrepancy. If this pattern continues, China's real gold purchases for 2025 likely exceed 240 tons, far above the levels shown in public data. This aggressive accumulation is part of a larger effort to replace dollar reserves. By holding more gold and fewer US Treasuries, China reduces the risk that its assets could one day be restricted in the same way Russia's were. Gold allows China to move value across borders quietly, without relying on the US banking system, SWIFT, or Western regulators. It is also a way to strengthen the credibility of the yuan as China pushes it deeper into global settlement and lending. Beijing knows that if its banks issue more RMB loans and the currency is backed by large strategic gold holdings, foreign partners will feel more confident using it. This fits perfectly with China's broader goal, building a sanctions-proof financial ecosystem that can function independently of Washington. All of this points to a slow but unmistakable financial divorce between the world's two largest economies. China is reducing exposure to the West, strengthening its own networks, and preparing for long-term competition. At the same time, Trump's handling of Russia's frozen assets is pushing more countries to question the safety of their reserves. The global system is shifting. The only question now is whether China can truly push the world toward de-dollarization, and how fast that shift will unfold. Share your thoughts below and make sure to subscribe. See you in the next one.